Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy podcast. My name is Chris Muntz and this is episode 76, Finding Your Niche with John Rutter. I'm not going to spend much time introducing John Rutter because even my non-choir friends on Facebook know who John Rutter is, and you all know who John Rutter is. And what I'm excited to do as part of the Choralosophy Oxford collaboration that I've been doing of late. By the way, on my website, you'll be able to find the other Oxford conversations, Rena Esmail, Will Todd, Bob Chilcott, and others on there. If you go to the website under the show tab, you'll be able to find all of the other Oxford conversations that are right there. And what's great about this is that it gives me an opportunity to tell some stories behind the names that you know. Of course, Oxford has a stable of composers that are all well known across the world and some of the biggest names in choral music. But sometimes you don't know what they're really like. And a podcast conversation is a great way to hear that person just open up a little bit and share a little bit about themselves. And so in this conversation, John and I go through his early years and his inspirations as a composer, as well as his sense of intimidation and or maybe even imposter syndrome in his younger years before he really figured out his identity as a composer. What is his niche? How is he different than other composers? And is that okay? Does he have to sound like John Tavener, for example? We have these conversations, and I appreciated John's openness. So we're going to get right to that conversation. Before we do, I just want to make sure that you remember, as school is starting, you need to get signed up for Sight Reading Factory with memberships for you and your students. Enter Choralosophy at checkout to get 10% off. Also, you're going to probably want to dive deeper into the science of music with your students. I think this is really important. You can search on my YouTube channel for Voce Vista demonstrations. That it is an amazing resonance and overtone software that mostly is used by voice teachers at the university level in voice labs. But I've found great ways to use it in a choir rehearsal, whether an online choir rehearsal or in-person choir rehearsal. So you can go to vocevista.com/Choralosophy and download it for free and play with it for 30 days. If you love it, you can go ahead and pay the license fee and enter Choralosophy at checkout and get 10% off there as well. And last, in this little intro, last little plug, go to mymusicfolders.com and get ready for the school year by hooking yourself up with choir folders, hooking yourself up with PPE, in particular, the resonance mask from My Music Folders, which I really do believe is the best construction, best quality product to use a mask in rehearsal. You can enter Choralosophy at checkout at that website as well. All of those promo codes go in and give you a discount, a little coupon reduction in cost, which helps you, it helps me, and it helps those great vendors over there. So again, I don't really need to introduce John Rutter, but we're going to jump right in and bring you this fantastic conversation with John Rutter. All right, everyone, I am here with John Rutter on the Choralosophy podcast on the next installment of the Oxford series collaboration. And I, of course, could not be more honored to have John Rutter on the show. John, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be talking to you.
I'm excited to pick your brain a little bit today, and I appreciate you joining us. Now, is that I'm going to assume that is not a real library behind you?
Well, no, it is a real library, but it's next door.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Just so that you and everybody else know, I am actually in my wife's study, and the real background behind me is her exercise equipment, including a hula hoop. And I have had various inquiries directed to me saying, do you really exercise, John, with a hula hoop? And the answer is no. So I thought that I would have a photograph taken of my room next door. And those books are genuine, and I have read and studied most of them at one time or another.
That's wonderful.
That much is real.
Well, that's wonderful. I love the behind the scenes information. Although I will say, I'm sure hula hoop would be a great form of exercise for hip flexibility.
You may be right. For exercise, I content myself with conducting, and taking the occasional long walk with my wife, because we live amidst some rather lovely riverside country where you can walk for some miles. It's sort of flat here. You don't get much in the way of up and down.
Oh, okay.
But you get some nice river views and some lovely waterfowl. I mean, we get swans and geese and ducks and herons and moorhens and various others, Egyptian geese, which are quite rare. And so that is actually my preferred form of exercise. And I'm afraid I leave it at that. But I slightly subscribe to the late Evelyn Waugh's theory that exercise is bad for you, because what you have is a certain number of poisons, floating around in your body. And if you leave them alone, they settle down in your legs and feet. And if you take exercise, all it does is shake them around, and that's really bad for you. And so I'm not a great taker of exercise, but the good thing about that is that I've never had to give anything up on the grounds of age. And so I have not so far suffered any painful retirement from a much loved sport hobby. And so I feel forever 27 on the inside, at least.
That's wonderful. So you never had to give up basketball because your knees went out, or give up football because your ankles were twisted.
None of that. When I left high school, I took a vow that I would never indulge in any form of competitive sport again, and I have pretty much kept it. Unless you count conducting as a competitive sport, which I certainly don't, because I don't think I'm in competition with any other conductors.
I agree, although I think many conductors feel differently, but I agree with your philosophy on that. We might come back to that a little bit later. That's so funny. I love that. So what I'd like to ask you first, and it's actually one of the questions that I love to start off as we begin a conversation on this show. I'm always interested in talking to people about what their, almost like in a comic book, there's always an origin story for a superhero. And so each choral musician kind of has an origin story too. Oftentimes it goes back to their childhood, some formative experience that they had that made them say, choral music is my vocation. It is my passion, and I'm going to devote my life to it. Do you have an experience like that you could point to?
Well, all music is my passion, not just choral music. But
Right.
It is true that I started singing almost before I started playing. And the playing part of it was the old out-of-tune upright piano in my parents' apartment that had been left there by the previous occupants. It was a top-floor apartment, and I think having got it in, they couldn't get it out again, so they left it there. And I did start to play the piano before I could reach the pedals or read music, I suppose from when I was about 5 or 6 years old. But before that, I was at school, my first nursery school. I must have been 4 years old, and each day began with singing in that school, because in Britain, it's the very opposite of the US law that it's never actually been repealed, but it's not observed these days, that each day in school must begin with an act of Christian worship. And that was something that was enshrined in the 1944 Education Act, where they were looking past the end of World War II. And the state was worried about the fact that it needed all the many church schools around the country to basically hand themselves over to the government. And we had a very wise and far-sighted Archbishop of Canterbury called William Temple, and he did a deal with the government towards the end of World War II, where he said, look, we will hand over all the church schools to you on condition that you build it into the curriculum, that there is an act of worship at the start of each day, and that at some point during each teaching week, there will be one scripture lesson of some kind. And the singing at the start of each day sprang out of the fact that it was like a mini church service. And so I recall singing All Things Bright and Beautiful, not my setting of it, but one of the familiar hymn tunes, and many other hymn tune favorites. There is a Green Hill Far Away, and oh gosh, oh God, our help in ages past, and all that. When I must have been no more than 4 or 5 years old. And I got a school report, which my mother kept and many years later showed to me, which had sort of good comments on my reading, writing, and my beginnings in arithmetic and all of that. But when it came to singing, it said, John sings well if he sings softly. I think I was maybe a little over-enthusiastic, but what I do remember about that early experience of group singing, and it was the whole school, see, I mean, the nursery school was not a large one, but I then went on at the age of 8 to a larger school, boys' school in North London. And again, we all sang. There was no negative peer group pressure against it. The school I went on to, Highgate in North London, was a boys' school, and somehow it was just natural and accepted that we all sang. And it started 5 days a week at 9 o'clock. And I remember thinking, I just wish the whole day was like this, that we could just carry on singing all day. I don't know why I loved it. It may have been something to do with enjoying something I was good at, because I was always hopeless at any form of sport. I can barely catch a ball to this day, and I couldn't then. It would usually go straight past me. And, I didn't enjoy team games. But the nice thing about singing in a whole school choir, really, is that you can contribute something as a member of a team, and you feel at one with all those people around you. So that feeling was implanted in my soul at a very early age. And it wasn't long before I knocked on the door of the school chapel choir and asked to be let in. And to be honest with you, Chris, I think they'd have had a job keeping me out. And so I sang not only with the whole school hymns at the start of each day, and that continued right through my high school years, actually, where we did observe that ordinance that had been passed in the 1944 Education Act. And at the same time, we sang in a concert chorus, which was selected from everybody who joined the school. I mean, in the senior school, we all took a voice test. We entered the school when we were about 12 or 13 years old. And any of us that could more or less sing a scale and match a few pitches was in the concert chorus, which taught me a vital educational principle, which is don't give the kids a choice. Sometimes it's best to just say, you do this and try it and see if you like it. And so we actually had something like half our school singing in what was usually an annual oratorio performance. And so I didn't just sing in Messiah. I remember the first year I joined as a boy treble, we sang Haydn's Creation, which is a work I loved then, and I love it still. And next year, we sang the Bach B minor Mass. And it was at that point I started to think, there's more to music than I thought. And I think it was at that point that I decided that nothing else would do for my life but music. And we went on from there. I also was in the much smaller chapel choir. Maybe there were, 30 of us in that group. And so although I was never a cathedral chorister, which remember is how so many British kids get their first grounding in music. Those who go on to be professional musicians, that is. I mean, if you'll find ever so many who started in the cathedral choir. Well, I didn't, but in my school chapel choir, we got to sing a lot of the same kind of music that we would have sung if I'd been in a cathedral choir. And our chapel was taken quite seriously at school. We actually had to turn up on a Sunday, although it was a day school, and Sunday was not a school day. We had to be there for a service that was held either a morning worship or an evensong. And so we got to do pretty much most of the liturgical music that was within our grasp. And so I would say I had a very thorough grounding in choral music. I did also play fill-in piano in the school orchestra, but I never had any great instrumental proficiency, I'm afraid. In the junior school, our whole class had to do descant recorder. We got handed those little plastic recorders, and I'm afraid that's as far as my woodwind studies ever progressed. And as far as strings is concerned, it's an unfulfilled longing. I was considered to have a good ear, and so it was my job to tune the stringed instruments before the class as the kids filed in one by one and handed me their violins, violas, and cellos. And I would kind of put them into tune for them. But that was as far as it went. And so I gaze in envy to this day at string players. And of course, I would love to have showed off on a trumpet or a trombone, because I love deep notes. Of course, all of these are unfulfilled ambitions. But the nice thing about being a composer is that you play them all in theory, and somebody else has to do the hard work of realizing your vision. But I suppose what I'm saying is that choral music was probably what I did most of in my school age years. And I never intended, when I took to composing, that I would in any way be pigeonholed as a choral composer, because truth to tell, I enjoy writing for anything you can get a note out of, whether it's a voice or an instrument. The only thing I don't really do is electronics. I don't work with electronic instruments. So if I were in the world of media music, that would be the norm, and that's what I would be doing. But that's something I've kind of stayed away from, I have to admit. And of course, the thing about the voice is that it's the most personal instrument. It's not just an instrument, it's a part of your body. And it's a means of expression of something in you. And of course, it also combines any kind of vocal music, my greatest love, which is music, with my second greatest love, which is words.
Yes.
Of course, there is such a wealth of fantastic poetry, sacred and secular, that is available for anybody to set who is at all interested in writing for choir. So it always seemed like choir was my family at school. We hung out together, the choir members. We were all pals, really, when I look back on it, just as I think a sports team would be.
Right.
And it seemed very natural. So the formative experience was choral, and it was entirely from school, because unless you have a large family, you can't have a family choir. And so it was an experience that came from school and from my school chapel in particular.
Well, that's a fascinating background, because, and as you were telling the story of growing up with choir, I almost picture your cultural immersion in choral music that came from singing at school with your entire school. That's an experience that I cannot identify with, because in the United States, we typically, especially as males, in many places, to sing in the choir is you are already different than everyone else.
Well, of course, yes, you're absolutely right. There's a kind of negative peer pressure which has grown up, and you would find that just as much in Britain as you would in America, I think, now. That there are plenty of young boys who would say singing, that's girls' stuff, I don't do that. Right. There was none of that, certainly in my school. In fact, it was considered really rather cool to be a musician and to be in the choir, not least because we entered choral contests. And we did sometimes win and come home with trophies. And so we brought a certain amount of fame and acclaim to the school, and that was considered good. That if we could bring home some honor and glory, then there was nothing bad anyone could say about us.
Right. Now, that's interesting that you transition to that, because earlier when we first signed on, we were talking about how briefly how conducting or being a musician is not a competition, and we don't see it as being competitive with others. Is that something that maybe we all kind of feel as young people, where that we see that value in the competition and then we outgrow it later?
Oh, well, there's a competitive spirit in most human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't given a very big dose of it when I was born. I don't, thankfully, see myself in competition with other composers or conductors at all. There's room for us all. And that's absolutely great. Life is only a race if you want to make it into one, where there have to be winners and losers. Mm. But I was given extremely good advice by my much loved director of music at high school, who was really consoling and advising me at a time when I felt very overshadowed as a composer by an illustrious contemporary of mine at high school called John Tavener, later Sir John Tavener, who of course went on to fame and fortune as a composer, very much associated with sacred music and nourished by the tradition of the Greek Orthodox Church in particular. And I thought, oh gosh, he is just so much better than me. What's the point? And that was when my director of music intervened and said, well, one person's gift doesn't negate another's. That there's room in the musical world for Ludwig van Beethoven, and there's room for Percy Grainger and Irving Berlin, or whoever you like to name. In a way, composers are all different. And one of the hard things, I suppose, about being a performer is that there is more of a competitive element, because if you are a gifted baritone, inevitably you're up against other gifted baritones, and for any given gig, they're only going to put one. And so will it be you or will it be the other guy? And that's something that I've never had to get into. I'm very happy to say that as a composer, I've got, I suppose, some kind of a niche. And if people want to book somebody else to write a piece, then I'm always delighted and happy for that composer, because I think particularly if they're young, it'll be an opportunity for them from which they will inevitably learn, and which will perhaps shed the rays of their career even more brightly around the world. So that's great.
Jumping in really quickly here to thank the supporters of my very quickly growing Patreon group. They're up to 85 over there now, last time I checked. And it's just an awesome group of supporters who decide mostly to chip in $3 a month. You can also do a $5 a month, $10 a month. There's even a $20 a month consultancy level where I will jump on a Zoom meeting with you every month for 30 minutes and help you solve your problems as a choir director. But there's all kinds of different benefits you can choose over there. But mostly people are over there to get the private podcast feed, as well as access to some of my documents and my rubrics and different things that I've discussed over the years on the show. So that's a great resource, patreon.com/Choralosophy. And a quick shout out to the producers over there on Patreon. That's the Patreon producers are Vasquez Academy of Music, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Chandler Smith, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, and Steve and Kathy Kikachik. It's an interesting contrast that you bring up there between you and John Tavener, because I love that that's the example that you have in your life experience, because I can't imagine knowing your music very well and your catalog, and I also know his very well. It's just they're apples and oranges in the way that...
Yes, and we had the same composition teacher.
Yeah, right.
At high school, at least, but our paths diverged after that, because he went on to the Royal Academy of Music in London, where he studied with the very noted composer Leonard Berkeley, and then with other teachers at a later stage. And I went to Cambridge, where my composition tutor was a very open-minded guy called Patrick Gowers. And the great thing about him was that he didn't try to tell me what kind of music to write. This, remember, was the mid-1960s when the avant-garde was in full flood and exciting new sound worlds were being discovered by composers, and an awful lot of tradition was being very deliberately overthrown and cast aside because they said, no, we've got to take new directions. When I mentioned Pierre Boulez and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Elliott Carter and so on, you'll know what I'm talking about. And as a private music lover, I'm always interested in the cutting edge. What's new? What are these guys up to? And of course, I use guys in a very gender inclusive tone because we've got so many more wonderful female composers that we were hardly aware of when I started. Okay, but if I've got any gift at all, it's not for writing that kind of music. And I was kind of allowed to do it. Nobody stopped me or tried to force me into a mold. And if you've looked at, for example, the history of serialism, 12-tone music, it was hailed as a new dawn by Schoenberg in the 1920s. And he said, I think I have invented a system that will guarantee the dominance of German music for the next 100 years and beyond.
Wow.
Well, there we are for an inaccurate prediction because it seemed to take over the compositional world of what you might call concert music and opera, that kind of thing. But then it faded, and goodness me, it's gone. So I'm really rather glad I never espoused it at an early stage and that I was just left free to write the kind of music I wanted to write. I remember a conversation with Richard Rodney Bennett, a very noted British composer and very versatile one. And he said, well, all that early stuff I wrote, that's all serial and nobody's ever going to do it. It's a kind of like having written a lot of novels in Esperanto, in a language that's just not come into general use, or it's passed away from it at least. And I never had that particular burden of a life's work behind me that was more or less written off.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of fortunate. So I sailed through really greatly blessed by the good advice of not worrying about John Tavener or any other hugely gifted contemporary, nor was I encouraged to worry about what was the approved compositional style of the moment. And I was allowed, as the saying used to go, to do my own thing. And that's what I've been doing really in all these many years.
Now, you mentioned earlier that your music might fit in, based on your compositional style. You have a niche. John Tavener might have had a niche. Every composer has, in some sense, a niche because they have their own musical language. That even if they try to vary the styles and they vary the instrumentations over the course of their career, you're still writing with your own voice. How would you describe your niche? What is the John Rutter niche?
Well, there's what I'm known for, and there's what I have actually done, which is somewhat more than what I'm known for.
Okay.
When I occasionally wrote music for television, I've never written for the cinema, but I've written for television a bit. If it's drama or historical or that kind of a thing, then my whole stylistic palette is broader than what I'm known for, I think, in choral music. In the world of choral music, I suppose people would use the word melody at some point if they wanted to associate something with me. And that actually leads me to believe, and I've only come to this belief in recent years, that I think I'm actually 50% composer and 50% songwriter. Because the thing is, if I was a composer working in the accepted current styles of concert music, and I'm thinking of people like Nico Muhly or Philip Glass or any of those, John Adams, nobody would really expect me to write a hummable tune. On the other hand, if I was a songwriter, like the great Stephen Sondheim, still happily with us, then my goodness me, he's written some wonderful tunes. And that's what you expect from a songwriter. That it's not a sin for a songwriter to put a key signature at the start of a composition. And so I've always felt that melody is important. And I've said this on quite a few occasions, but any time up to the late 19th century, you wouldn't have lasted 10 minutes as a composer if you didn't have an outstanding melodic gift. Think of all those guys, Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, all of them could write fabulous tunes. Now, they could do a lot more than that besides, but the time came, and I think Stravinsky was the first to actually say this outright. He said, "I lack the gift of melody." But my goodness me, it didn't stop him being Stravinsky. When he really wanted a tune, he often borrowed one from Russian folk music, and that was absolutely fine. But think about the revolution that took place, I suppose, at the start of the 20th century, where composers began to explore things other than melody. Texture, orchestration, tone colors, new structures, new links between music and the other arts. And it was almost as if melody kind of crept out of the room. And what, of course, happened was that it took refuge in the world of operetta and the musical theatre. But it had already happened, you see, by then, even going back to the second half of the 19th century. Johann Strauss the Younger couldn't have written Tristan and Isolde, and Wagner couldn't have written the Blue Danube. They were already diverging and different paths, different kinds of music. And in the 20th century music, of course, I've been exposed to a great deal of it during my life. I would say that I have an equal admiration for composers who you wouldn't think of as melodic, but are fantastic composers. Really all the usuals, Stravinsky and Debussy and onwards and so on. And at the same time, I've always had a great attraction for the songwriters. And first among those in the 20th century, I would actually place the American songwriters who wrote for the musical theatre, that extraordinary American art form that couldn't have happened anywhere else because it represented a melting pot between European opera and operetta on the one hand, and the kind of local American forms of ragtime, jazz, blues, folk music, and so on, that all came together in one glorious kind of new art form that was not like anything that there had been before. Mm-hmm. And so I learned a huge lot. And of course, it's so interesting that it's okay in America. It was okay for composer like Aaron Copland or Leonard Bernstein to be both. They both had a melodic gift and all the kind of structural and textural gifts that you need as a composer. And so if I am both songwriter and composer, I'm certainly not the first, but I think that the most potent example I've always had in my mind have been in American music in the 20th century. And so perhaps that's the niche I occupy. The people who probably tell you that my music does sound very English, and well, I grew up, that's my native soil. I grew up in England, but at the same time, music is international, and I've always looked to wider horizons. And I think it's no accident that an awful lot of my first professional opportunities came from America more than from my native land. And at one time, I sort of often thought, well, gosh, I could really very happily live and work here. I didn't make that break for personal family reasons and all of that. But at the same time, I know that I've been nourished by the heritage of American music. And let's call it cultural appropriation, please, because it had a much better word, which was cross-fertilization, that musicians will learn from each other around the world. And that's what makes music so rich and wonderful. And so I think if I'm in any sort of a niche, that's probably it. Writing for choir you do have constraints that don't apply if you're writing for an opera company or for orchestra, because for the most part, both of those are professional type operations. And whereas we would have to say the majority of choirs are made up of students or amateurs or children, volunteers of one kind or another. There are, of course, professional choirs, the radio choirs and so on, in various European and Scandinavian countries, and one or two like that, sort of paid professional chamber choirs in the United States as well. But the center of gravity of the choral world is probably with children, students, and amateurs of one kind and another. And of course, because they haven't all had the same intensive musical training that a professional violinist will have had, and they can't all necessarily even read music to a very advanced degree. You actually have to work within those limitations while always looking to see if you can stretch them just a little bit out of their comfort zone.
Absolutely. So does the melody then for you in your compositional process, does the melody come first? Is that the first thing to go onto the paper?
Oh, that's very hard to say, because the process is different with one piece and another piece. That generally I would agree absolutely with what, I think it was Mozart's widow who remarked this about Mozart when she said that for Wolfgang, the beginning was crucial, just getting the right starting material. And it might be just a little motif. It might be like the opening of the Beethoven Fifth Symphony, which is only two notes, but in a very distinctive rhythm. But out of sometimes quite small germs, which may be melodic or shorter, in which case we'd say they're motivic, that's what the whole composition will grow from. You know, out of the acorn grows the mighty oak. And so, yes, my first ideas are often melodic. And it's interesting that even in a work, an early work of mine, the Gloria, which gets done quite a bit, the melodic ideas come from Gregorian chant, which I played with very considerably. I took one of the melodies associated with the Gloria text and played with it. I turned it upside down and backwards and stretched it out. But it actually underpins all three movements. So that had a melodic origin, but the melodies, of course, were 1,000 years old. I didn't think them up, but I just manipulated and worked with them.
Right. I'm going to send us in a slightly different direction now, a little bit more philosophical. Mike, what I'm really curious to hear you kind of reflect on with us a little bit is that you've had this long and storied career, and I'm not calling you old, but you've been doing this now for a long time and been notable within our choral sphere for a long time, and of course. Sold a crap ton of music, and I'm sure Oxford loves you for it. And then the pandemic happens at this stage in your life, and things probably paused in ways that you're not used to. How do you continue to have a why, and draw motivation to press forward and continue making music? Where does that come from?
Well, I think I was better prepared for the pandemic than most people, because composers work in isolation anyway.
True. Yes.
But we're used to spending long periods on our own. And like a swimmer who's underwater for some of the time and then pops up and just takes a look round, that's a composer's life. So the composing part of me wasn't really affected. What was affected was the conducting part of me and the music making, because as a conductor, I felt as if my right arm had been cut off. Suddenly, the conducting I do it is sprinkled throughout the year in patches in quite a number of different countries. And I don't think I realized how much I would miss it until I wasn't able to do it all of a sudden, just cancelled dates in my calendar everywhere. And only now is that starting to return. And my goodness me, I'm relieved to have it back. As a composer, I suppose in the long term, you don't want pandemics to continue for terribly long, because there's no point in writing pieces that are not going to be performable by groups. Mm-hmm. I have taken to writing some solo literature. I've just written a guitar suite, for example, and I did a piano album of transcriptions of some of my choral pieces, things that just one musician can do in isolation. And so that was not exactly a new direction, because I've written solo music before, but let's say it was an opportunity. I think my heart bleeds for people who are in the musical profession or are entirely geared towards performance, because your lifeblood is cut off, and what do you do? And of course, there have been many resourceful answers that musicians have come up with. Some have painted their garages, and just taken advantage of the spare time to clear the attic. And that's generally the kind of chores you don't really get round to in normal times. And of course, that carries you through you can motor on with that for a few months, but there then comes a point where you think, well, what do I do next? There's been quite a crop of memoirs from senior musicians in the last year, which I've enjoyed reading, because that's the perfect lockdown project, really. But in the end, of course, musicians can't be cut off from their brothers and sisters in music. It's not right, and it's not a natural state of being. We are all nourished by each other, and it's not just the music making as a group that binds us, it's the whole social aspect. And I would say that that's particularly true of choirs, that you make friends in a choir, you bond with the people around you. They are often transgenerational, which I think is a very healthy thing. It's not like just having your high school year meet for a reunion, because in an orchestra or in a choir, you will get people of many ages, many temperaments, many political beliefs, many different sorts of life story. And I think that's absolutely perfect as an extended family. That's what we all actually need in our lives, because you can't just mix with people of your own age and or own beliefs. It's called the echo chamber syndrome, isn't it? Where you only ever meet people who think exactly like you do, and that's bad for us all, right. For our open-mindedness, for our ability to debate and discuss and disagree agreeably. And of course, the symbol of that is once a choir starts singing, all their differences melt away. And you become one. And it brings people together. And of course, potentially it brings peoples together. Actually, one of the interesting things that's happened in the lockdown is this phenomenon of virtual choirs, where, yes, I know it's not the same as meeting in the flesh with all the other singers in a choir, but it's potentially international. Which is fascinating, because you can get a choir made up of people who are in all different countries but singing at the same time. People who live in remote places, people who perhaps can't join a regular choir because maybe they're caring for a partner or something like that who's not well. And in fact, it broadened out the whole choral world in a rather remarkable way. And I would predict that once the pandemic is behind us, and I think we're moving into that phase now, we all hope, virtual choirs will actually continue to play a part in the whole choral universe. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Now, do you ever feel yourself tempted at the stage in your life that you're in now to say, I've done enough in choral music and I just want to retire? Or does something keep you lit?
Why would I do that? Of course I don't want to retire. I mean,
that's what I want to know about.
Never. I mean, each day is a gift. And I don't want to sit at home staring at the wallpaper. I mean, I want to carry on doing what I can do. And after all, we perhaps wrongly believe in my vocation that the best is still to come. The best piece I've ever written is the one I haven't written yet. And maybe the next one will be it. Who knows? And all you need is enough health and strength to pick up your pencil. And that doesn't take terribly much. And you don't even need a proven demand for your work, because composers will carry on regardless of anything. And as long as there are choirs to write for, I hope to be writing for them. It's an honor and a privilege. It's awfully hard work. And I suppose if there's a change now, if I compare me today with me when I really was 27, and not just 27 inside, I have lost the appetite for staying up round the clock to get a piece finished at the very last minute. I think I plan my deadlines a bit more carefully. And if I can avoid them, I do, because I must admit, I do like a reasonable number of hours sleep each night, and I am not so good at doing without that. I think it is fairly important.
Well, that's actually a really satisfying answer for me to hear, because I was trying to drill down at that why, and it sounded, and your response being that because maybe your best piece is yet to be written. I think that's a really good metaphor for how a lot of us feel about music making. I kind of liken it to the idea that you can achieve some level of proficiency as a performer or as a composer or a conductor or a teacher in my case. And I can look at each school year, for example, and say, wow, I got better than last year. I did my job better than I did last year, but I could do one more thing. There's always one more thing I could do.
Well, we all have a sort of spectrum of the worst thing that we're capable of doing and the best thing we're capable of. And what I hope is that the platform kind of rises a little bit over the years. And we do learn from our experiences. We do learn not to make some of the same mistakes as composers and conductors that we once made. And if we're going to rise just a little higher, well, I always like to say that's in the gift of Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music. And of course, we all know that she's a very capricious lady, and she flies around the earth and sprinkles her fairy dust just wherever she wants to. And she sprinkles it on the deserving and sometimes on the undeserving. And she sprinkles it on nice people. Most of the composers and conductors I know are very nice people, but occasionally she sprinkles it on somebody who is slightly horrible. And I'm afraid that is just the way that it works. But I do know there are pieces I have written where I would dearly have liked a visit from her, but I think she was probably busy elsewhere. I don't know. She's able to be at once. I didn't get much fairy dust for some of the things I wrote, but I'm not going to tell you which ones.
That's great. That's great. So why, I've got kind of another philosophical question, and I know you've been asked something like this before, but why does the world need us? Why does the world need choral musicians, and in a way that is maybe more than just a frill?
Well, okay, we all need music. The world needs music. And the thing about choral music is that anybody can participate in it. Anybody can't be in an orchestra. You have to learn an instrument and you have to be able to read music to some level first. And so choral music is a wonderfully inclusive form of music. So the question really is, why does the world need music? It's a fundamental human impulse, and I find that very hard to actually pin down. But we are all born wanting to sing, and some of us have a better singing voice than others, we all want to enjoy rhythm, and some of us have a better rhythmic sense than others. But not everybody is going to respond to music. That's one of the hard lessons that you learn in the playground or soon after, that it's something that calls to perhaps the majority of people, and I wouldn't like to put figures on it, but you have to just say it doesn't call to everybody. But for those it does call to, it's an expression of what makes a civilization civilized, I think. And more basically than that, even pre-civilization, it's an expression of ourselves, a part of ourselves that we can't put into words. And that is so tremendously important because every human craves expression. And some of us are not very good with words, and yet we can express ourselves with music. And some of us are not very good at social bonding, but in music, we can bond with others and come together. And all of that is so important. Music is a symbol of harmony. It's an obvious thing to say, but there is so much discord in the world, perhaps more than ever because it gets amplified by social media.
Yep.
And that's the dark side, unfortunately, of the great technical advances that have come our way from computer science. And in a sense, hatred, grievance, dissent, all of those have become potentially more confrontational. And as we sit in our own rooms and follow social media or type our messages, which may be kind or they may be very unkind, we are atomized. That I think, computer science and social media and the internet have both brought us together, and yet they have driven us apart. And I think the great thing about choral music is that it symbolizes togetherness and harmony, where you leave the disagreeable parts of your personality at the door and you just focus on something that's a group endeavor. And there's no real way of describing to somebody who hasn't experienced it the extraordinary high that you get from making music together. It makes you feel better is such a cliche.
It's an understatement.
At a very profound level, it does make you feel better. It makes you whole. And if a rehearsal, even a mundane rehearsal for a work that you're learning, a Verdi Requiem that's a few weeks down the track, if you've had a good rehearsal, you will leave that rehearsal walking on air, no matter how many troubles you were carrying on your shoulders when you walked in. And that, in such a troubled world, is a very valuable thing, particularly now that we've got the pick of all the world's bad news. And that's quite hard to cope with. I mean, musicians are often sensitive people. And when we see what's happening with a famine in Africa or some terrible war that's going on in a remote country, in Afghanistan or something like that, we want to do something about it. And are we actually carrying a heavier load than any previous generations have been asked to carry? I think we are.
Yes.
And music is more than escapism. It's affirmation. It's a way of saying that's not all that there is in the world. There is also love and there is harmony. And there is genius. And, genius is the little bit of yeast that makes the dough rise of lumpen humanity. And again, it's very hard to describe, but you know it when you encounter it. And it transcends gender, it transcends time, it transcends place, and it continues to speak to us. And one of the important ways that genius does speak to us and raise us up is through music, which is one of the purest of the art forms. And so I stand by it as a pillar of our humanity and our civilization.
That's wonderful. And there were so many really important insights in that response. And one of the things that I'm hearing and I pull out of that is you've almost created a dichotomy, setting social media and choral singing almost at opposite ends of the spectrum, and how they cause humans to interact, which I think is a really profound insight. When we sing together, when we make music together, it creates a social and an emotional lubricant for us to almost like a cog in a wheel that needs to be greased. Like,
yes,
it creates that, whereas social media almost puts sandpaper between the wheel and the cog. It causes the opposite problem. And so when we think
well,
about,
it can do. It certainly can do.
Mhm.
And that is such a shame.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a wonderful bit of reflection on that topic. Before we run out of time, I'm also interested in hearing a little bit more about some things that you've been cooking up during the pandemic, and you've got a new thing called choir guides. Tell
Yes.
me about that. What's going on with choir guides?
Well, it's something that's been in my mind for a number of years, that I have gone out and done singing days on Saturdays as a volunteer thing for anybody who invites me. And I have realized that there's a huge untapped potential, really, for people who love choral music but are a little shy of joining a choir, or who have joined a choir but feel a little embarrassed because they're not great music readers, and they perhaps feel that, oh dear, I'm not as quick as I should be with this. And I thought, well, a way I can help them, and I'm certainly not the first, is to create a choral learning app where you can listen to a choral piece and hear it complete as a performance done by a 9-voice group, is what I've used, 3 sopranos and then 2 of everything else. And at the same time, if you want to single out the second tenor part, you just hit the second tenor button and you hear the second tenor part highlighted, and the other parts melt into the background. They're still there, but it's like the second tenor is singing right at you.
Uh-huh.
That's a way, I hope, of encouraging people to learn their part before they go to rehearsal and save the conductor's time, and possibly strengthen their music reading, because the score rolls by as you hear the real human voice singing. And with a bit of luck, you can build a stronger association between the dots that you see and the notes that you hear. And of course, the earlier choral learning apps tended to not use human voices, but to just have vocal parts played on a keyboard. And that's fine, but it's not human, and it, of course, hasn't got the text. And so I determined that if I was going to do this, that I wanted to use real human voices, and they would be clear and accurate and give people what they needed to set them up for a rehearsal, or to contribute their part to one of these virtual recordings where you sing into a phone and then somebody mixes it all together.
Right.
And the only slightly embarrassing bit from my point of view is that I thought, well, I can't record the entire canon of Western music one voice at a time, which is how you have to do it. I thought, well, I better start with mostly my own, because possibly that has not been covered by some of the other excellent choral learning apps that there already are out there. And I have recorded now 2 tranches of short choral pieces. We did 15 of them a year ago. And then I'm right now in the middle of editing a second tranche of 18 pieces, including some Christmas carols of mine. And hopefully that will be ready for release in the fall. But that was a lockdown project because, of course, I couldn't get any kind of ensemble together during the last year. But what was perfectly okay was to record one voice at a time, which is how you actually have to record these app things. if you want people to be able to truly isolate one voice part. And so I had a procession of singers come into my studio last year, and with headphones on and the accompaniment track, they would sing with crystalline purity and accuracy. I'm going to compliment them. And you then have to just piece it all together. And that's something that I enjoyed. Also a lockdown project, because it's just in my little production studio next door to here.
Yeah.
And I've enjoyed doing that. I hope it'll be useful, is really what I hope. And not just while this pandemic continues, but long after, because there will always be people whose love of singing in a choir is not necessarily matched by their sight reading ability. And I hope that this will strengthen them along the way, and also save their conductors a few headaches.
That's great. That's great. Now, is that no, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, no, that sounds like an awesome idea. Is that an independent project of yours, or is Oxford involved in that at all?
Oxford were not involved. No, it's an independent project, though the music, given that it is mostly mine, is actually published by Oxford. Mm-hmm. And so they've been involved to that extent, and very supportive and encouraging of it. But no, it's something I dreamed up myself, and I pretty much carried out myself. I'm not a coder, and so the actual development of the app on the website and the design of it were done by highly expert professionals. And of course, that they told me in no uncertain terms that what you are asking for is totally unreasonable and completely non-standard, but we'll do it. And in a real can-do spirit, they have now delivered something that I think actually does work, is touch wood, as we say in England, bug-free, and we hope will help choral singers everywhere.
It sounds like it. Speaking of the idea that we heard earlier from you, which is that at any point, the next John Rutter piece might be the best ever John Rutter piece. Do you have anything coming out in the next little while? Maybe anything new that people should look out for?
Oh, my goodness me. Well, I do know that I'm writing 2 new Christmas carols. That's intention, not fact. But I promised 2 different organizations that I will serve up a new little carol. Hardly a dramatic new departure in my composing life. I have already, but maybe there'll be room for 2 more. I will continue to write choral music, I'm sure, but something that's actually beckoning to me, I have to say, is orchestral and instrumental music, because in the nature of a career, one gets a bit typecast. And I like to think that I can write perfectly okay for orchestra and indeed for solo instruments, but it's something I've not as often had occasion to do. I've just been recording with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. That's actually half an album of my orchestral music, and I've got to write some more. And I must say that that's something I very much like to follow up. And I love voices and instruments together, of course. I haven't written all that much a cappella choral music, and so that will actually be something that I might address myself to more and more. And I may be pushing back a few frontiers, because one of the things that surprised me was that when I've written more challenging choral pieces, both stylistically and just in terms of the demand level, they seem to have been taken up by some really awfully good choirs. That, for example, my Hymn to the Creator of Light, which I wrote for the 3 Choirs Festival back in the 1980s. And I never thought that that would get widely done, because it really isn't easy to sing. You need it's double choir, lots of divises, lots of strange harmonies. You do need a good choir to do it, but it seems to have got done quite widely. And so maybe I will be pushing the envelope a little bit. My wife always says to me when I'm about to start on a new piece, she said, "Oh, go on, John," she said, "surprise everybody." So I will see if I can do that.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Okay, so I have one more question, and it's also related to your music. And so it's kind of a two-part question. What is your bread and butter, the piece of music that you've probably sold the most, like your top seller, your most popular thing? And then the other part of the question is, by contrast, what's a piece of music that you wrote that just didn't seem to take off, but maybe you thought that it was pretty good, so you liked it, but maybe other people didn't?
Oh gosh. Well, I tend to, on the second part of that question, I tend to side with Giuseppe Verdi, who just said, "Let the public be the judge."
Okay.
It's not for me to say that I've got a favorite neglected child. Maybe somebody else will come up with it. People do sometimes write to me and say, "Oh, what a shame that we don't ever hear this or that piece more often." In terms of my best sellers, it depends whether you mean large pieces or small pieces. Because I haven't written all that many large-scale choral works, but the ones that have been there longest tend to have sold the most, I think. I've never compiled the statistics, probably just because they've been there longest. And so the Gloria and the Requiem, which date respectively from the 1970s and 80s, have probably sold more copies than A Mass for the Children or The Gift of Life, which date from this present century. And so they've not had as long to establish themselves. For short pieces, well, I think I'd have to divide that into seasonal and non-seasonal, because among the Christmas carols, well, the very first one, at least it was in the very first batch, there was the Shepherd's Pipe Carol and the Nativity Carol, and those I never thought the shepherd would still be piping in the 21st century here, but it still seems to be. And he first started piping in 1967 when that was published. So that has gone on far longer than I think anybody, including my publisher, ever thought that it would. And of more recently written carols, well, What Sweeter Music, that got used in a Volvo commercial, has done rather well. Let's have the Candlelight Carol is another one that seems to have got around widely. Someday I'll sit down and actually do a statistical compilation of non-seasonal pieces. The ones that I tend to keep hearing about are The Lord Bless You and Keep You, which has been done on, I think, 3 royal occasions now. For the Beauty of the Earth, which was performed, I remember, at our late Queen Mother's 100th birthday celebration in St. Paul's Cathedral, and of course has been done on lots of other occasions as well. And, hard to tell. The Gaelic Blessing is the shortest piece I've ever written, and it seems to still go the rounds. But none of us know why some pieces prosper and some don't seem to. It is always the case that a good public occasion that gets widely witnessed will do a lot for the spread of a piece.
Yes.
I think once The Lord Bless You and Keep You had been done on a royal occasion, I think it then sort of picked up in sales after that. But I don't actually follow all this terribly carefully, because as a composer, you just cast your bread on the waters. We do your best. We all do with each and every piece that we write. And we tend to be philosophical about their destiny after that. It's a cliche, but I think it's true that your compositions grow up and leave you. You always feel attached to the piece you've just written and you care about it. And then after a certain point, it really becomes public property, that it's for other people to make of it what they will. And I think I'm probably quite in line with other composers when I say that I always hope that anything I've written will get a good first performance, and because people form their impression from that.
Yeah.
And of course, sometimes you can recover from a bad first performance. I mean, Bizet's Carmen was roundly condemned by all the critics, and it was booed and hissed in 1875 when it was first done. And of course, it's become one of the world's best-loved operas. And so it recovered from a bad start. But once a piece has got launched, then you have to just let it go. And if it does well, that's a bonus. And if it doesn't do well, shrug and go on to the next one.
That sounds very fair and very healthy. Well, John, I appreciate your time. This was really fun to hear your thoughts and your reflections on some of these issues that you live, that are your life. So thank you for spending the afternoon with me.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you, as always, for sticking around to the end of an episode. I hope you enjoyed that little conversation, being a fly on the wall with John Rutter. I know I was a little bit nervous for that conversation. He is, of course, a big star, and it was so great of him to join us on the show. Although I have become a little bit used to talking to pretty famous people on the show. There's something about John Rutter, of course, being a choral legend my entire lifetime, and I'm old, so that was awesome. And I enjoyed learning a little bit more about the person behind the music, which is really what I hope to do on all of these Oxford episodes, is bring you the person behind the music. Yes, their music is great, and yes, I'm sure it's awesome if you use his choir guides, or it's awesome if you buy one of his pieces of music, but that's not really the point. I want you to understand who these people are. So if you enjoy this content and this show and its wide range of topics, from COVID to social justice to Oxford conversations to student perspectives, all the different things that we've done on this show, you can sign up for the Patreon, patreon.com/Choralosophy. Other ways you can help is enter the promo code at any of the vendors that are doing such great work on the show. If you need sheet music, ryanmain.com and graphitepublishing.com are great resources. And then, of course, Sight Reading Factory, My Music Folders, Voce Vista, all of those things are great products that can and will help you if you choose to participate in those. And entering Choralosophy at checkout gets you that discount. And as always, like, share, and send smoke signals to the moon, or whatever it is you can do to get the word out about the show. I always appreciate it. Thank you so much. See you next time.